You're listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We're coming to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations around Vancouver, BC. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to Rethreading Madness.
When I've never been further, knowing what the hell I'm gonna do. When I can't seem to find my way under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright, don't you worry, it'll be
Today on Rethreading Madness, I'm talking with Amy Avalon and Carolyn Clement about the consequences to the client when a therapist transgresses boundaries. Amy Avalon is a retired private practice therapist and a passionate advocate for survivors of sexual and emotional abuse by their therapists. And Carolyn Clement is an award-winning family photographer, mother of two, and the survivor of therapy, child, and sibling abuse. Amy and Carolyn have been with us before and have come back to expand on that interview with more information about how trauma at the hands of one's therapist impacts on the survivor. Too often, when it comes to the subject of professionals who exploit their clients, whether it be emotionally, physically, or sexually, there's a tendency in the general public to not only minimize or outright dismiss the negative impact, but in some cases to apply a positive result. The spin where people see it as the client got extra attention from the therapist. In his paper, Sex Between Therapist and Client, Ken Pope noted that Masters and Johnson asserted that any therapist who had sex with their client should be charged with rape in a criminal court of law. So today, in honor of those who have gone through this profoundly damaging form of abuse, we're going to lay it out without holding back. And so, therefore, I want to take a moment to let people know that we're going to talk about some difficult material. The content may be triggering, and we ask folks to do what they need to take care of themselves during this hour. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
100.5 means non-commercial, listener-powered community radio. 100.5 means music, public affairs,
I have a dream,
and arts programming.
I wish I loved the human race. I wish I loved its city face.
You won't find anywhere else on the radio dial. 100.5 is not owned by a huge corporation. We are owned and operated by people like you, by your community. 100.5 CFRO Vancouver Cooperative Radio. Find our complete program schedule at coopradio.org.
So welcome, Amy and Caroline, and thank you for coming and chatting with me about this important topic, abuse by therapists. Again, it seems to be an issue that either people don't know about it or know about it and don't know where to find information on it, or they're suffering in silence. And so it just feels important to keep talking about it. Today, I want to focus on the three ways in which abuse by a therapist can impact on a client. And I do that because I think it's really misunderstood and minimized often in terms of what has happened to the client in these situations. So I want to talk about dependence. I want to talk about betrayal. And I want to talk about sort of the love versus hate loop clients can end up in and why that is so common and what we already know about it. So let's talk about dependence. I think it's fairly common with the folks I've worked with and have heard about, where the therapist actually kind of goes out of their way to create or develop an enormous dependency on them, sort of 24/7 contact and the personal emails and phone calls and activities like being a friend, going to dinner, to the movies, introducing them to their family. Why is this a bad thing? Because some people would look at that and say, well, that client is really lucky. They're getting extra special time by their therapist. So tell me in your words and from what you see, why you see it as a bad thing.
I will say that dependence for me started while I was in session. Just to go back, I was in therapy for 4 months, and within a couple months, the grooming started. And my sessions would go from 50-minute long sessions to suddenly he was bumping his patients after me so that we could have more time together. And so all of a sudden, I would have 80 minutes with him instead. And as soon as we began talking outside of therapy and he called me, he wanted to have access to me all of the time. If I didn't respond quickly enough, then he would ask where I was. And he very much created this an overwhelming, like it became like an obsession. He just kind of took over my life and all of my time. And it felt very gradual, but at the same time, it really didn't take very long.
Mm-hmm. So when you say obsession, was that from him or from you?
From both of us. I felt like he was obsessed with me, wanting to always have access to me. And then because I was getting such great feedback from him, or getting the positive reinforcement, I wanted to be there more often. And in the beginning, it was all just very dreamy, and it hadn't yet turned to really being abusive or hurtful and harmful. So there was, again, it was grooming into, this is how close we're going to be. This is how intertwined and enmeshed we were going to be.
Right.
And that was right from the very beginning.
Had you ever been that enmeshed with another person in your lifetime?
I have always been codependent.
Right.
And I had been abused as a child, which is why I was there in the first place. So I didn't really have a good sense of myself as like an individual even before entering therapy. And I think it was just, I was just extremely receptive to all of the kindness and all the love and all the attention.
Carolyn, when that started, did your abuser therapist couch it as this was part of you getting better for him to have this kind of contact with you?
While we were still in therapy, yes, it felt like that was just us getting to know each other and being able to relate on a different level. So we would talk about being parents. We started with something that was very relatable and resonated with both of us. So we would speak about parenting and our children.
But was he saying that this was part of your treatment?
No, I think he actually, I think he kept it as a separate thing. Oh. He wouldn't tell me it was for that. No, it wasn't, because he didn't say it was to benefit therapy. I mean, he certainly started sharing more about himself, and he was disclosing more in our therapy sessions, but he never specifically said, by me disclosing this, I think it'll help us.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. I think also that what sort of lends itself to the dependency is that when we go to therapy, you're told to bring your problems to your therapist and talk it out and sort of figure out what to do. Or if you're confused about what to do, your therapist is there to help you sort of sort it out. And when therapists start to blow those boundaries out of the water and you're still doing that, I know in my case, I'll just own this. What ended up happening is not because I was so dependent or anything. It was just sort of naturally occurred because she was there so often and talked so often, and that I would bring up the issues that I was looking at. And suddenly all of the things that I had to make decisions about were being passed by her, all of them. Mm-hmm. And when I look back now, I look at that and I realize that was one of the things that created such a sense of dependency, that when it blew up, and of course these things always blow up, I was left feeling like I didn't know how to make a decision anymore, that I couldn't make a decision, that I felt like, my sense of confidence in myself was gone, and making a decision just became overwhelming about anything.
Yeah, they really just hijack your entire life.
Yes.
Yeah. And Carolyn, when you're talking about how quickly your abuser moved in that way, I mean, to me, that just speaks to, gosh, he must have been doing this for a long, long time, because usually the abusers will take so much longer in grooming, and they'll couch it as, oh, I'm going outside the rules, because you're really not supposed to be contacting your clients outside of session, and certainly not through text and email that have non-clinical meanings. But they're usually, the grooming will be, oh, this is actually to increase the benefits of the therapy, of the treatment that I'm offering to you, so that he just didn't even go there. It's pretty astounding. He was just so arrogant.
I think I was doing more research on my end to try to figure out what transference was, and how the relationship in therapy could be beneficial if it's addressed the right way. And instead, he just made it all about him right from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because that is something that commonly happens. Like they commonly create this incredible dependency on them, and then they shift it over until the relationship no longer is focused on the client, but becomes focused on the therapist and what the therapist needs to talk about or process or do, or whatever their desires are. It suddenly becomes a 100% focused on the therapist.
Mm-hmm. And I think the client is trained to behave in ways that are pleasing to the therapist. So, so yes, like you said, it's completely about the therapist and the therapist's needs and gratification. And the client is kind of walking on eggshells, just hoping to avoid any disappointment so that they won't be abandoned. So there's dependence on that as well. And the client becomes, we lose more and more of our sense of self in deference to gratifying the abuser.
And I don't know about you, Carolyn or Amy, but for me, one of the things that I was often bringing to my therapist was issues that came up in relationships with other people. And so often her solution was, well, something that would encourage me to break away from people. So by the time I really got it, how bad this was, I was so isolated. I had given up my friends. I'd given up my family for other reasons, but I had given up my friends and the people that I had come to know. And so not only do they create this incredible dependency, but then when a relationship does blow up, and like I say, it always blows up, the person is left often very isolated and alone. And that's a part of how that dependency is created as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the other thing too that I want to highlight for your listeners is that it's specifically stated in almost all of the ethics codes, the standards of practice for all of these professions, that the therapist is not to foster dependence in the therapeutic relationship. So, and we're trained about this through school. So all of these therapists know that this is not therapeutic intervention. And it really is abusive from the very beginning.
So how do you suppose they manage to convince themselves that it's okay? Or do you think they are taking what they know and simply exploiting clients, knowing what they're doing?
If I could answer that.
Sure.
I think so. My former therapist actually specializes in ethical boundaries in therapy. So he is literally writing the book on ethics. And so I believe it's a passion project of his to be able to figure out what worked in previous situations. All of his research is about exploitation in therapy. And it's actually very disturbing for me now to realize that he is very aware of the loopholes, and he knows I'm going to have to testify in November at the state licensing board. And I think that's going to be the last test that I have. I think he thinks that I'm going to not go through with it. So he decided to go all the way. So I will have to testify, and it's going to be really difficult to have to do that. But I just feel like I'm going on a tangent here, but
No, I can hear the anxiety in your voice.
I was gonna say, I felt it coming in.
Yeah, we will be surrounding you with so much strength and support. I hope you know that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So you're saying that he decided to go all out, believing somehow that, you would just back out, and so therefore he would be exonerated because you backed out.
Exactly. I think the idea, certainly in the beginning, I feel like I was chosen. I was selected because I had young children. I had said that I was happily married. So I think he felt like there wasn't a whole lot on the line for him, because why would I go and blow up my entire life because of him? And then I just started believing all of it so deeply. He started talking about getting married and who would be at our wedding, and this was within 2 months of no longer being in therapy with him. So I believed all of it. I believed the entire dream of what he was selling me.
Right.
And again, the impact is that right now, as I'm speaking, I have so many thoughts that come up all at once, and it makes it very difficult. I think like brain fog starts kicking in a little bit, and then the trauma response comes in. And that is also, it can be embarrassing. It can be, it makes me anxious at times, because I do feel like I'm going to either sound dumb or like I'm not all there. And in many ways, I'm really not. Like I'm healing a lot, but this has caused me incredible physical pain and distress, mentally, physically, and my nervous system. It's been awful.
Would you consider that to be in the category of PTSD?
Oh, I have severe PTSD. Yeah. It's complex PTSD, actually, PTSD, because I had been abused through my entire childhood, and really it's been 4 decades of abuse. So the last couple of years have been really, really difficult. And now I feel like I'm finally coming to the other side where it doesn't take over all the time. And I'm not constantly thinking about the traumatic experiences. So it is a long process.
They say that 92% of us experience severe PTSD. And so for our listeners here, PTSD is either one of you can jump in and correct me if you don't agree with what I'm saying, but it's a response to being incredibly traumatized, mostly life-threatening trauma. And that could be actual or perceived life-threatening trauma. And it includes flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, the inability to control your feelings, having nightmares. What else, guys? What else do people with PTSD have?
Hypervigilance,
yes.
And nausea for me. I was constantly sick to my stomach first thing in the morning.
Right.
And I think this is what you see, and this is the reason why dependency on the therapist is so discouraged from the get-go and is clearly stated in the codes, is because what you're seeing is that this kind of abuse shakes the person's very foundation of trust in themselves. They are conditioned by the abuser to give all of that over to the therapist, to the point where a lot of victims feel that they don't even know who they are anymore without their attachment to the abuser, because the abuser has been dictating to them who they are in that relationship. And that impact is so huge, because when the whole point of therapy is to help the person build their own strong foundation so that they don't need therapy at all. And to go completely the other way, it really is so destructive. It is like, to me, it's just like taking this person's soul and very, like that early attachment, trust and mistrust, it really taking that away, so that the victim now has to reformulate that again.
Yeah. And with that, and that's a very good segue. Thank you. You summed up dependence really well. And we're just going to take a little break, and we're going to come back and talk about betrayal and what that betrayal does around issues around trust. So we'll be right back, folks.
The Downtown East Side Women's Center has been helping self-identified women and their children for decades, but today, the DEWC needs your help. Due to the COVID-19 crisis, the center has had to cancel its annual in-person fundraisers, depriving the center of crucial financial resources. Services such as hot meals, clothing, showers, and secure mailboxes are now in jeopardy. To find out how you can help the Downtown East Side Women's Center, please visit their website at dewc.ca. That's dewc.ca.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and today I'm chatting with Amy and Carolyn, who've been on the show before, again about the abuse by therapists of their clients, but also we really wanted to just sort of hone in and talk about some of the very particular ways in which this form of abuse can impact on people who've put their trust and self in the hands of a therapist who has betrayed them. And that is the next topic, which is betrayal. I just want to start off here by talking about how when we go to therapy, I don't know about you guys, but most of the people I know don't really understand the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist, or a counselor and a social worker, or, you know, somebody who's regulated with a college and somebody who's just registered as an association. They don't understand ethical boundaries. They are going into therapy in pain or in trauma or in a state of confusion and being told to sort of, if you feel kind of okay with this person, put your trust in them to help you. And so in doing that, in therapy, your job is to let down your defenses and tell the therapist all the things you secretly hang on to in your life, you know, the pain, the trauma, the confusion, all of those little things that happen, the secrets. So Carolyn, you talk about having childhood trauma. I have childhood trauma. I don't know about you, but I know for me, my trust was severely damaged coming out of childhood. I had a lot of defenses that allowed me to operate in the world and basically be okay. And when I went to therapy, my job was to break down those defenses and let this person into my inner world and trust that they were going to act on my behalf. And I don't know whether or not everybody does that. I know that that's what I did. I have heard other people did that. Is that kind of what you did, or would you change that up?
I actually did. Mine was a little different. I feel like I've always been very trusting and very naive to a fault. It doesn't make sense that I would be, because I don't have an upbringing that would lend to being trusting. But I think I've always been so hopeful and optimistic. And because I could never imagine pretending to be someone I wasn't, I kind of assume that other people don't have it in them. Right. So I trusted from the very beginning. I thought I was looking to a therapist to be my Yoda. I wanted someone who could guide me and who could tell me, this is what you need to do. I went in there very trusting. And then I think because of that, it felt like the betrayal was so much harder, or it was harder anyway, because I just didn't suspect it. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that my doctor could intentionally be trying to hurt me and harm me, because I went there to a trusting professional. So I had a very hard time actually coming around to it, instead of being doubtful or questioning, and then also thinking like, well, I already knew from the beginning that I shouldn't trust everyone. So
yeah, for me, I got to the point of trusting her, which was very new for me. I had never trusted anyone in my life. So eventually I got to the same point you started at, which is it never occurred to me that this person would do anything to harm me. She was a feminist. She had a lot of political bottom lines that seemed to imply that could never happen. But so what happened? Sorry. No, go ahead.
Just to say, I also, because it had been my family that had harmed me, I thought that at least a professional, if I was going to be paying someone to take care of me, that it was almost like that was going to prevent me from being harmed.
Right.
So I think that's why after the fact, now I have a very, very hard time trusting anyone. I don't care if they are a professional, if it's an attorney, if it's another therapist. I just don't. I have a very, very hard time believing that other people are able to hold themselves to a certain standard. And it's because I couldn't have been more betrayed by what felt like the best relationship I had ever had.
Right.
And then it was just taken away.
Right.
And then given back and then taken away repeatedly. So it was constant over 7 years.
When you say taken away and given back repeatedly, what did that look like?
Well, in psychology, or in I think it's ACA, the American Counseling Association, you're supposed to stay away from your patient for 2 years after
5.
therapy.
5.
Yes. All right. Well, he had pretended that he wasn't aware of that restriction or violation, and so he ended up the way that he ended it the first time was saying basically to wait for him for 2 years, and it devastated me because he just very quickly and abruptly blocked me, wasn't answering calls. I find silent treatment to be the hardest thing to handle. It just reminded me so much of growing up.
Right.
And then just as I was trying to move on with my life, he came right back in and made it seem like we had had a chance to be able to be together. And so the whole thing just repeated itself over and over. And he would say, wait for me for another year. And I would try to go on and just try. And again, I was just so hopeful if I'm just patient and just wait it out. But then I started seeing that the cycle kept happening in the exact same way. And every time I felt more and more confused. And as the time was going on, I was healing a lot from my childhood trauma. And that's when I realized, oh my goodness, all these personalities fit a similar kind of script, or like they all blame me for everything. And I'm supposed to worry about all of them.
Right.
And it just became so clear that that's why I couldn't see it before. I was just so used to it. I only knew abusive relationships, unfortunately.
Yeah, it gets normalized. And I did a lot of work around childhood trauma and childhood sexual trauma, and the overlap between an abusive therapist who sexually exploits their client and a child sexual abuse offender is so consistent that it's shocking. And for me, that's why it became so normalized. I just, it was what I knew. And, but yeah, the whole thing of telling people you're special and I never do this with anybody else and you can't tell anybody or my life will blow up, or, all of those things, they're so consistent in terms of what we grow up with and then what we're dealing with in therapy as well.
And this is something we hear a lot from victims, that the therapist is telling them there's this sort of period where they have to be separate in order to legitimize the relationship according to the standard. And the standard is, whether it's 2 years or 5 years, the standard is the same across the disciplines, which is there's no contact after therapy is formally terminated before a personal relationship can begin in that 2 year or 5 year period. And even then, there's a clause that says, and that client can have absolutely nothing in their history that would predispose them or make them vulnerable to exploitation.
Right.
Anyone who has any sort of trauma would therefore be an exception to that. So it really is never. And with social work and psychiatry, it is once a client, always a client. There's no window of time. So, but we hear this all the time where, they're sort of stringing the victim along as if they're trying to observe the rule. But the rule is, you would have never been available to him anyway because of your history, and he knew that. And it really becomes like a very sinister drug pusher. And it's just like with all pushers, the very thing that you believe can take away your pain is in fact what is the reason for your pain.
Yeah. So that betrayal that people go through, and it's what you're describing, Carolyn, is very common, is that somewhere along the line, the therapist who's been pushing this idea of, oh, this is all okay, don't worry, we're doing fine, suddenly becomes aware of having transgressed boundaries, or I'm speaking on their behalf and I absolutely have no idea. I'm just speculating that either they become aware or they've been caught and they're trying to clean up their act, and suddenly they just break off and they abandon that client that they've been grooming and developing this relationship with over a period of time. And that ends up doing just as much damage, that abandonment, at that point, after you've been exploited and you sort of given up your own common sense and your own decision-making process, believing this person, and then suddenly you're just left with
discarded.
Nothing. Or, as what happened when I talked to Amy Nordhughes, she was asking him and he just turned on a dime and became cruel and malicious. And that also is that break away from. So abandonment or cruel, we end up realizing how betrayed we've been in what was, for me, the first relationship I ever trusted somebody, and the very relationship that I thought was indicative that I was, this healthy, emotionally healthy person.
Wow. I mean, we just all experienced such similar.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess it is grooming. I'm sorry. See, and again, I keep forgetting.
It's the trauma bond. The trauma bonding that happens.
I was absolutely trauma bonded to him. Absolutely.
And that's that phenomenon that, that happens certainly with that discard, and certainly, Carolyn, and you're talking about that repeated, sort of exciting rejecting, okay, let's get back together. Let's not, and so the client becomes, or the victim becomes bonded in trying to regain the person that they thought this person was. The trauma happens, and it's like, oh my God, you cannot be this person. So I'm going to keep trying again to find that man that was my fantasy, or that woman or that person who was my fantasy. It's somewhere in there.
And this kind of goes back to Dr. Porges, I may be saying that wrong, who kind of equated what happens with exploitive therapists is that the client sort of becomes addicted to that. So you can look at the beginning of therapy where you're being treated as special and you have all this access. It's sort of like love bombing. And once you're dependent on that love bombing and you're kind of isolated and everything, once it's pulled away, you're constantly trying to figure out how to get it back.
Well, and that's actually how my therapist especially got me hooked. It's because he very suddenly tried to terminate therapy with me and had basically decided that I was done. And we had covered everything we needed to, which didn't make any sense to me, because I went on and had 4 more years of trauma therapy. I had a lot to unpack, but he wanted to move it forward. And so he said, I think we're done here. And that really, it triggered a lot of my fears of abandonment. Why does he suddenly not want to see me? He says, I'm funny, I am creative, I am charming. He says all these nice things. Why does he not want to see me suddenly? And that made me feel unworthy. All the reasons that I was there anyway. And I got really angry, and I felt like this was like creating another abandonment. And so when he did call me and told me that he was in love with me a week later, it just felt like it really was a drug. It suddenly took away all of the pain of wondering what I had done. And it was like the biggest, it couldn't have been more of like a celebration in my heart. Like, I was so happy to hear that I had been wrong about it, and that it really was as amazing as I thought it was going to be.
Right.
And, yeah.
Right. We need to just take another little break, folks. So don't go away. We'll be right back with Amy and Carolyn.
We've been sitting at this corner table so long, the waiter just gave up, trading our stories, both the proud and shameful. I think we know that we both have a little crush. Oh, your whole damn ship crashing on the rocky shores. Oh, on the rocky shores. Oh. It's a special kind of full moon crazy. Make somebody throw it all away. You started never and you moved to maybe. Before you know it, you'll be thinking you just can't wait. Oh, once you hear the sirens, go, go. Cover your eyes and just go, go. Or you're gonna find your whole damn life crashing on the rocky shore. Oh, on the rocky shores. Oh, on the rocky shores. Oh, on the rocky shores. Oh.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Pulp Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and right now I'm chatting with Amy and Carolyn about abuse by therapists. And we've talked about the incredible dependence that exploitive therapists will cultivate. And we talked about betrayal and how that all sort of fits into that. And I want to expand on that. But I know, Amy, you wanted to talk a little bit more about therapists who foster this dependence. Can you expand on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so as we've mentioned that, this is very clearly stated in all the ethics and standards that we are not to foster any dependency in clients. That is against the rules. But one of the things that we were talking about is most of the predatory therapists will encourage clients to trust them and to say, it's important to break down your defenses and you have to be more trusting and tell me your story. It's important that you share as much as you can. And the way that I was trained, and certainly a lot of my colleagues were trained, is actually, no, you don't do that. You let the client decide how far they're willing to go and honor their ability to maintain their own boundaries and their own defenses until they are ready. Mm-hmm. So when a therapist is trying to encourage you, and it's sort of like an antiquated thing, like, really pushing your edge, or, some sort of encounter groups from the 70s or Gestalt practices, those things are reserved for when, the client has done already a lot of other work, because otherwise they can be re-traumatizing. So the therapist's role is to say, you've come by these defenses honestly, they serve you in a lot of good ways. Let's find the ways that you can keep your defenses where they're necessary, and where they're, not helping you, fine, we can change them. But it's not the client's job to, become just completely open to this therapist. And they are not, we're not there to say, you have to trust me. I have to earn that client's trust. Right. And they can take as long as they need to. And if they can't trust me, then it's okay for them to move on to another therapist. Right. But these predatory therapists will, be needling and sort of pathologizing the client who isn't a good client by revealing all their secrets or being over trusting, right, or breaking down their defenses. Defenses are there for a reason. We have to be discerning in this world. And so it's important to support any client's defenses, because some of them serve us well.
Absolutely. My therapist told me point blank after a year and a half, if you have to trust me, and if you can't, therapy is over. That's it. I'm done. Yeah. It was like, I'm a year and a half in. And so the process of me trying to do that reduced me to a crazy person, because it was so terrifying for me to do that.
A therapeutic intervention would be, here we've been working together. I can feel there's still a lot of trust issues, and I would love to know, is there something that I'm doing that I could change? Can I do more of something or less of something in our sessions that would help in this regard?
Mm-hmm.
But to give you that ultimatum, trust me or it's over,
Right.
is really pretty sickening, because the therapist may be doing something they're unaware of that is exacerbating a trauma in the client, and they can fix it,
Right.
or explore it. But there should be no tacit trust on the part of any client. That's not your job as
Right,
a
exactly.
client.
Although that is what we're told a lot
Yeah.
as clients going into therapy by our friends and family. You just need to trust them. Just trust them. Just go and trust them and tell them what
Yeah. No, I
So
don't
what
believe
I'm
that.
hearing in here is that there are a lot of ways that clients are encouraged to not rely on what they're seeing or perceiving, and that they are given other ways of thinking about what's happening, i.e., I'm not exploiting you, I love you.
Mhm.
So it's no surprise that we end up getting to a place where we sort of understand that maybe some of the stuff has been grooming and abusive and it's been harmful, but we're still in a place where we still care about that person. And our feelings haven't been inauthentic. It's their feelings that have been inauthentic. And so it's very hard to navigate that. I've been abused, and I'm going to decide I'm worthy enough, even though my therapist did this to me, to confront them and expect them to do better. And if I say anything, I'm going to blow up their lives, and they're going to lose their family and their wives and their profession. And it puts clients in a very, very difficult position.
Mhm. Mhm. And it's 100% the responsibility of the therapist, and was from the very beginning. If the therapist's life blows up in any way, it's completely their own doing, has nothing to do with the client.
I agree. But I also know that therapists will often say that to their clients, that they're
Absolutely.
exploiting. If you say
Hmm.
anything, I will lose my job. If you say
Yes.
anything, my wife
I'll
will
kill
leave me.
myself.
I'll
Yeah,
kill
a lot of them.
myself. Yes. I
My
won't.
my former therapist would say that we would be hated equally, that no one would like us, that we obviously that we would both be responsible for it. And then he would also make sure to mention specific people's names and say, that's why this person hates you. And I thought, what, I don't even know who this person is, but it was just the idea that he just constantly wanted to chip away at the idea that it was only his responsibility.
Right.
And then when he found out that I filed a complaint with the state licensing board, he just started harassing me and threatening me and cyber stalking.
Mm.
It's made it very difficult to be able to come forward, because I feel like I've taken away his mask, or I feel like I'm a very big threat now to him, and it makes me very uncomfortable knowing like what he could do or what kind of feelings he has towards me now.
Do you think, this is just a question coming out of my own experience, Carolyn, but do you think it's also partly that we've grown up knowing what our role is as the victim?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have the same sort of confidence in our role as the defender or the enforcer, or, whatever archetype that we can throw in there. We just don't have the same skill set.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? I'm just sort of
It's,
following an idea here. So,
well, I was actually thinking it's because of my children that I especially want to move forward with this, because what if it was one of their coaches, or it was someone in their life, and I wanted them to be able to know that this is the kind of thing that you have to be able to move forward with. You have to be able to talk about it. And I'm sorry, what was it you had said, Bernadine?
whether or not, because we spent so much time in our childhoods being a victim, that role is comfortable for us. We know that role. We don't have the same comfort around standing up for ourselves, or disclosing, or making people accountable for the ways that they've harmed us, and so it's just not as comfortable.
So I actually think that's one of the biggest signs that I've been healing is I feel very, very strong now. I feel almost like unstoppable. I feel like I've figured it out and I understand now what has happened to me. And even though I have emotional flashbacks, I also have this understanding now that it really wasn't me. And I just absolutely want to go. I want to take all of the anger that I have and just try to advocate for other people who aren't able to speak up themselves or they don't know what's going on. But no, I feel really empowered. And after 18 months of, I mean, I was having seizures, I was having a really, really rough time processing all of this. So I've come so far, and yeah, I'm actually going to make something good of this.
Good. And you have a website out there, I believe.
I do.
Tell us about your website.
So it's unethicalboundaries.com, and it's basically just a place for other victims or people who think that they might be affected can go and look for education or support, or just, you know, to not feel like they're the only ones. So I'm trying to share my experience and also what has helped me on my path.
Right. And Amy and we are both volunteers for an organization called TELL, which is you can find at www.therapyabuse.org. But also, if you want other kinds of support as well, you can go on Facebook and look up therapist abuse. I think there's a Reddit thread on therapist abuse as well. So a lot of people are talking about this, and there's a lot of ways to get information and find information now. We just need to figure out, you know, the right Google words. I remember trying to find it when I was you know, just absolutely traumatized, trying to figure out what had happened. And every time I Googled therapist abuse, sexual, I just got therapists who dealt with sexual abuse. And so it took a long, long time to find TELL. So
yeah, there was another one of our responders who was in it for many, many years as well. And she had Googled, but she never thought to use the word abuse. It was a very uncomfortable relationship to her. There was a lot of pain, but she never thought to use the word abuse. And I think that goes to what we were talking about, is like, how do we stand up to this kind of pain? When you think about it too, collectively as a society, at least the way that I was growing up, when I was taught about predators or perpetrators or bad people, villains, they pretty much look the part. I was never taught about the villain who comes across as your best friend, the answer to a prayer, you know, someone who's going to be your primary caregiver, the love of your life. Those that archetype was never given to me. And so I really grew up never thinking that, you know, that it could come looking that way.
Yes.
Because I think most of us, when we see something that's, you know, just black and white wrong, most victims that I know are actually very fiercely protective of people in those situations.
Yes.
But when it comes to someone who appears one way and then the mask comes off and we're just utterly confused that we never picked up on this, none of us have been raised to expect, anticipate, and or deal with that type of villain.
It's also hard, I think, for folks who are just sort of coming to recognize what has happened to them, to go from, I've had this fantastical relationship with my therapist, and even though it's taboo and not okay, and I'm not supposed to talk about it, I felt really loved and special and cared for, and, you know, and to recognize, then having to recognize the exploitation in it, you know, that is there. It's just a matter of perspective. If I'm going to look over here to the, you know, and not look at all of this other stuff, or am I going to look over here at the exploitation and have what, you know, made me feel loved and special and cared for turn into essentially grooming. You know, it's a really hard place to do that. And I think it takes people a long time and being in a lot of pain to recognize that it wasn't love, and it wasn't being special, and it wasn't somebody listening to them for them or what was best for them. It was being groomed. It's a very hard thing to recognize how you've been victimized sometimes.
Definitely. And it's
especially if
hard
you
to
have enough.
imagine that someone can behave that way for years and years, that someone is really wired to be that duplicitous.
Mm-hmm.
That was just one of the things that was hardest for me to accept, that really there is no humanity in there. There is
Right.
no responsibility in there. And, I think Amy Nordhus said that too. Like, you keep looking for, wait, it couldn't
Right.
have all been just
Yes.
a lie. Could it have been? Like, how could someone behave so convincingly?
And I do want to say in here that just because a therapist has been exploitive or abusive does not mean that all of the therapy is toast. It isn't that you haven't done the therapeutic work that you went there to do as a client. It is that this other thing happened that became much more prevalent and dominant and destructive. So I want to say that because I feel like sometimes people feel like because my therapist was this, that meant all the work I did was nothing. And the truth is, most of the therapeutic work we do happens outside of therapy. So it should not be dismissed.
That's a great point. And there's a lot of healing that can come from surviving this kind of abuse. I think you're seeing that in Carolyn, where she's feeling unstoppable, that it can lead to a wisdom that we would never have otherwise.
Right.
A wisdom and an internal strength, which is completely the doing of the victim. That's all our work.
Yes.
And there's nothing to congratulate the abuser for that, but it's just that internal resilience and strength that gets tapped into in order to survive this kind of pain.
So I don't know about you, Carolyn or Amy. I know that your experience is a little different because you were a professional who was abused by another professional who was exploiting his client, and you were trying to make everything better. Not better, that's not the word. You were trying to confront him and got abused out of that, right? Did I explain that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, but there is this thing of, am I worthy enough? This is kind of dramatic, but am I worthy enough to report this person and blow up their lives? Should I, is this thing that happened between us important enough to destroy someone's whole career? And I think that part of that is that they are really playing on our compassion for other people. And that's not uncommon for people who come from abuse backgrounds to have that level of compassion for others and to put themselves aside for the benefit of others as well.
Yeah, and I think the abuser will groom the victim to believe that that this is a one-off incident, that this would never have happened were it not for that particular victim. Which is, of course, as we know, we see that these are mostly serial abusers who have many, many victims, but these victims tend to blame themselves, and so that's part of the problem too. Is that reluctance to report or blow up the person's life as they think, well, he's not going to do it again to anybody else.
Yes, and I suspect that society at large thinks the same way because we had the same ideas around teachers who were sexually assaulting their elementary school kids. The schools would simply go, okay, well, we'll just move him to another school, and and the thing that's prompting him, i.e. the child, to betray his oath this way will be out of his periphery. And so we'll send them to another school. They sent priests to other churches. They sent them eventually to farms where they would, all the pedophile priests would go. And now I'm seeing the same kind of ideas here, which is that somehow it's not really the therapist's fault. I think I mentioned this before on air, which in the 90s, I overheard therapists talking, not just once, several times, where they would talk with each other. The whole issue of sexual abuse was coming out, and they were grappling with how to work with clients. And they often said, you have to be careful with sexual abuse survivors because they're very manipulative and they will seduce you, i.e. it is the victim's fault, right? And that's what you're talking about, Amy, this idea that somehow the offender and the victim are equally responsible for what happened. And if we just move them along, somehow that offender will not harm someone again. So I think also that associations have the same problem, i.e. they're afraid of being sued. for actually following up on a client's disclosures, or they also they identify with the offender being another therapist and don't want to blow up their lives unnecessarily, and so therefore make it very, very difficult for victims to disclose and to make reports as well. So
that's been the hardest thing. Is I thought the hard part was going to be deciding to come forward.
right.
And it's actually been the process of having to come forward. I feel like he is absolutely protected, and no one is really interested in pursuing this and in finding and holding anyone accountable or making changes. And I feel like, the insurance companies are also in it. They don't want to have to be responsible for their members who rape their patients.
No.
So the whole thing has it's been very eye-opening to realize that even when you do end up having the courage to speak out, that you might find that there's really no one to listen in many cases.
My therapist point blank told me that no one would believe that a woman would be a rapist.
Mm-hmm.
And that has held out in many cases. So it's,
and my colleague said to me, we've already decided if you say anything, this is what we're going to say. Because at that point, his victim was still very much in the thrall. And so we'll just deny everything, and we will, essentially, no one's going to believe you.
wow.
And I think that's a very common thing that they do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry, folks, but we have to stop. So thank you, Amy and Carolyn, for coming and chatting with me again. So folks, that was Amy Avalon and Carolyn Clement. They've been on my show before. I have no doubt they will be on my show again as we continue to examine the ways in which clients suffer at the hands of their therapists and the consequences of that. So thank you again, folks, for coming and chatting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Question authority, demand accountability. The job of the journalist is more important than ever. Democracy depends on a free press, and reliable, trustworthy reporting is at a premium. Speaking up for those who have long been silenced is what journalists do every day. At Langara, journalism students hit the ground running, reporting on issues in their communities right away, wherever they are around the world. This fall semester, instructions will be entirely online. That means students will be reporting on the issues that matter in the communities where they live. Wherever you are, whatever your beliefs, journalism has always been telling the stories that demand to be heard. We welcome your voice in the chorus for a change. Langara.ca/journalism.
You've been listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and that's our show. Amy, Carolyn, and I have touched on only 3 topics that survivors who have been assaulted by their therapists are coping with. There are many, many more. 92% of victims of therapist abuse experience severe post-traumatic stress. And while they're trying to sort out what happened, they're doing so most often in extreme levels of ongoing anxiety, confused by why their therapist, whom they had come to trust, had done something so heinous, and while they're realizing how isolated they now are as their primary support system, the therapist is not only no longer there, they are actively attacking them as abusers do when they are caught. So if you've experienced this, please know that there is support for you, and please reach out. Our website resource page has several places where you can get information, find resources, and get support. You do not have to travel this road alone. My thanks to Amy Avalon and Carolyn Clement for coming and chatting with me today, and to Sherry and Julia Ulrich for helping modify her song's intro to fit our new intro and extra, but also to Sherry for the gift of her timeless music, which sings us in and out of our program every week. And as always, our thanks goes out to you for joining us today. Stay safe out there. You've just listened to Rethreading Madness, where we dare to change how we think about mental health. We air live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. or online at coopradio.org. If you have questions or feedback about this program, or want to share your story, or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. This is Bernadine Fox. We'll be back next week. Until then.
When